So on these 4 problems, we are asked to graph some trig equations, and this one says we want to graph the cosine or 2 cosines of x rather. So we need to do some things about cosine. Number 1, we need to calculate the period of cosine. We do that by doing 2 pi divided by the number in front of x. And since this doesn't have a number in front of x, it's a 1, which means the period is 2 pi. So on our graph, we can instantly put the 2 pi mark. That's where the graph is going to end. Halfway in between there is pi, and then of course here's your 0. So here we'll go to the left with negative 2 pi as well as negative pi. So next we turn to the amplitude. We notice that the amplitude is 2. So where cosine normally starts at 1 above the midline, an amplitude of 2 means it's going to start at 2 units above the midline. Okay, so what we should know about cosine is it starts at a max when it's positive, and it ends at a max when it's positive, and in the middle it has a minimum, which is going to be negative 2 in this case. You need to memorize that about the cosine so that you can graph it like this every time. So here are the maxes and the minimums. And of course, in between every max and a min is a 0. So we have a 0 at pi over 2, and a 0 at 3 pi over 2, and a 0 at negative, and a 0 at negative. Now from these dots, we should be able to make a semi-smooth looking graph as best we possibly can to go through all the points. So this is twice as tall as a normal cosine graph, but it still has all of the other characteristics for cosine. Okay, now secant is friends of cosine, and we normally graph the secant by starting with a cosine graph. Okay, wherever the cosine has a maximum and the minimum, the secant has a parabola. So the secants are actually parabolic looking. So we're going to graph it by using our friend the cosine. So the first thing we do, the cosine has been moved down 1 unit. So we put in our midline 1 unit down. The first thing we do is we graph the midline. Okay, we notice that there's no number in front of x, so the period is going to be 2 pi. So we'll put a 2 pi mark over here, and then a pi mark, and then of course a negative on this side. And we notice that there is a negative 2 in front of the word cosine, so that's going to be our amplitude and tells us where we start. So because it's negative, cosine will start 2 units down, okay, below your midline, where positive cosine starts above, which means it's going to end 2 units below the midline, and at halfway it's going to be 2 units above the midline. So our midline's at negative 1, means your maximum is at positive 1. So here we have another one, and there we have another one. Okay, another maximum and another minimum at negative 2. So now we need to find the zeros. Everywhere in between a maximum and a minimum is a 0. So here are your zeros. The 0 is where the graph crosses your midline rather than the x-axis all the time. When we're graphing it, of course, the 0 is where it crosses the x-axis, but for graphing purposes, we want to know where the midline is. So that's really all we need to know. Yes, the cosine graph goes like this, but that's not part of our secant graph. The secant graph has an asymptote everywhere the cosine crosses the midline. So at all these points where the cosine crosses the midline, 1 over 0 is an asymptote. So we put the asymptotes at the places where cosine crosses your midline. And now we have enough information to actually graph our secants. So we put in our secants. They do not cross your asymptotes. They have a maximum where cosine has a minimum, and a minimum where cosine has a maximum. So this is the graph of -2 secant of x minus 1. All these parabolic looking things. So moving down to 7 and 8, we notice on number 7 that it has the -1 means we move the whole entire graph down. So we put a midline through y equals -1. Just like we did on number 6, you move the midline down. And now we notice there's a 2 in front of the x, which means we're going to have a period adjustment. So 2 pi divided by 2 means that this graph has a period of pi. So on our graph, we put a tick mark with pi on it, which means this is going to be pi over 2, and this is going to be negative pi over 2, and this is negative pi. So unless your graph already comes with labels, you can put them wherever you need to put them in order to make your graph look nice. So because it's sine, we should know that sine starts at the origin and ends at the origin. So at pi is where it's going to end, and it's 0 in the middle. Okay, so when we sketch the graphs of sines, we always sketch the zeros first. Cosines, we sketch the maxes and the mins. So for sine, now we'll do the maxes. Okay, it has no amplitude, so that's a 1, which means we go up to 1 unit halfway between our zeros, and we go down 1 unit halfway between the zeros, and then up 1 unit halfway between the zeros, and down 1 unit halfway between the zeros. Okay, all these things happen on nice, even intervals. So sine, we graph the zeros first, and then we put in the maxes and the mins. Cosine, we graph the maxes and mins first, and then we put in the zeros. So remember, when we graph these things, make it as smooth as you can, trying to hit all of your points so that it looks nice and round rather than jaggedy teeth. Okay, so the difference here between your graphs are the fact that we have labeled pi as your period. So it starts and ends by the time it gets to pi. Now the last one, too, cosecant. Cosecant is related to sine, so I'm going to sketch 2 sine first. So it has no midline shift, so that's right down the axis. The period is also 2 pi. It has no number in front of x. So I'll put in my 2 pi here in my pi, my negative pi, and my negative 2 pi. And it has a 2 as its amplitude. So I'll put 2 tick marks going up and down, positive 2 above, negative 2 below. So since I'm sketching sine, sine starts at the origin, ends at the origin, and has a 0 in the middle. So those are the zeros for sine, and it has a 0 at pi and a 0 at 2 pi. Okay, it's positive, so it goes up in between your zeros first, and then down in between your zeros second. Okay, down this way and up that way. So these are your points of the sine graph. But we're graphing cosecant, so everywhere sine has a 0 or intercepts your midline, the cosecant has an asymptote. So we put in our asymptotes wherever sine intersects the midline. So at the origin, at pi, at 2 pi, at negative pi, at negative 2 pi, all of these places have asymptotes. Okay, secant and cosecant, we graph them with asymptotes as well as tangent, cotangent, but that's later. So now we sketch our graphs where sine has a maximum, cosecant has a minimum. Where sine has a minimum, cosecant has a local maximum. So there are parabolics from the maxes and the mins of your sine graph, And that's how we do the cosecant.